Good afternoon and welcome.
So let's start by showing you again our protagonist. A couple of years ago, the Alfetta that with Fangio conquered the World Championship. So a short video, Alfetta in Silverstone.
Ecco l'Alfa 158, la famosa Alfetta.
Line up at the start for the four Alfa Romeos, the fastest in practice in the front row. There it is, 1 minute to go.
Il Gran Premio d'Inghilterra a Silverstone, da sempre severo banco di prova per auto e piloti di tutto il mondo, ancora una volta confermò che l'Alfa poteva dominare da padrona la scena automobilistica internazionale.
In 2019, in Silverstone, the audience stood still when Kimi Raikkonen drove the Alfetta when he won the first Formula One Grand Prix. But this car, which is still living, just like the 6C3000 CMs linked to Fangio name, was used all over the years, and Fangio drove it several times with the same car with which he won the first World Championship. The Fangio that we are narrating today was one of the great characters, maybe the most important pilot of the post-war period, but he was also a man who left indelible memories in the heart of everyone who knew him, mechanics, colleagues, friends, who he made in Italy during that experience. And today, our backstage, as usual, has guests that want to tell something more, apart from the cars, from the documents that we will see later. And today's exceptional guest needs no presentation. And I'm sure he's not new to this museum. He had the opportunity to come here to visit it, and also it was his right to sit in the Alfetta. Well, my name is Fangio because I'm the elderly son of Juan Manuel Fangio, the World Championship the winner of the World Championship in 1951 with Alfa Romeo, which was so successful. It's a pleasure being here to talk to you today in this anniversary. It's the 17th year of the first win of the championship with Alfa Romeo. It's an honor for us, and we thank you for participating in our backstage. For all of us, Fangio was an incredible champion, but who was he really? Well, I could explain you that he drove and raced more than 200 races, and when he was competing in our country, he did it with cars that in Europe were already obsolete. But here it was what people were using in 1939, 1940. And I think that in part this was a huge school for him because they were racing on beaten track circuits, not on tarmac. So as you can see in Italy and in Europe, in that era when he was a champion, he drove in a different way. For example, he did what we call controlled drift. So the auto proceeds in the curve sideways, not straight. So it was a good school to race here on beaten track races, and it was very useful in Europe to drive and manage the power of Alfa Romeos with narrow wheels and light cars. So it was very hard to overpass, but he was very used to drive in this way. And I think that this was a very important step for his driving mode in Europe. Which were the most important points of Fangio as a man and as a pilot? Well, he was a very good mechanic. And I think that this was another thing that helped him during his sports career, because when he went off the racing car, he knew how to express to the mechanics what was the problem or what they should have changed in order to improve the performances of the car. Today, everything has changed because there are engineers, they put numbers in a computer, but in the past, when he was driving, the human factor was still fundamental for the handling of the cars. So the fact that he could express very well to his mechanic what the auto had or how it performed, it was an advantage for the racing team and for the pilot. And I think that this was a very good base for him in order to go to Europe and be a winner. And moreover, talking to him once, he told me, because I was also racing and there was a problem in my team, and he told me that the driving lifestyle of every pilot was individual, that each one of us is born with a function in life and with a way of driving, and that you cannot pass down to others your style. So, in the memory of the big names of Alpha who met him, Fangio was a great champion, but also a very nice and gentle man, very polite. He was like that in personal life. Well, first of all, I think that we have a, a very close relationship with Italy. We're very similar. Argentinians are half Spanish, half Italians. But in Italy, the small towns, and in general, small towns are very humans, very welcoming with everybody. I was lucky enough to visit several times Italy, and I also lived in Italy for a certain period of time. And this is a characteristic of the villagers, of people of towns. In the big cities, you live differently. Everything is quicker, and you cannot be so nice, maybe. My father came from a small town, and he was gentle and polite with everybody. Of course, with me as well. We lived together and we talked about many things, but he was always polite with everyone, with the mechanics especially, because he always said that the basis of the win of a pilot was the mechanics. So he shared everything with the mechanics. And that is true. The mechanics is the basis of the pilot, is the number one pillar. But he was nice with everyone, always. In his long career, Fangio drove many cars, American cars, the ones that he built himself, and then in Italy, Maserati, Goldini, Ferrari, Mercedes. But the one which had it win the first World Championship was the Alfa Romeo. Was it in the heart of the great champion? For a pilot going to race for a specific brand, a special brand like Alfa Romeo was, and especially when you start a world championship, because before the 50s you were racing without world championships. So when he went to Europe for the first time, he knew that he was going to race a couple or three races. He didn't know that he would have stayed in Europe for so long. So when he was offered to drive the Alfa Romeo, and it's like, how to say, when a singer is offered to sing at the opera in Milan, it is something super special. at the top, so it was a big step for him. And he was also a winner. So in 50 and in 51. And for him, this was the biggest jump, the trampoline in his life. So it stayed in his heart. Forever, Alfa Romeo stayed within his heart because it gave him the possibility to show that he was a champion. These races were of another epoch. You not only needed talent, but also you needed to have a vision of race, an intuition of risks. Are there anecdotes that Fangio liked to tell when leaving the race, apart from driving the cars? Well, there's a story that he remembered very well about Alfa Romeo. It was when he won in Monte Carlo. I have a photo album here that I cannot show you because it's huge. When the Prince Ranieri was giving him the trophy. But the previous day, so before the race, he saw a movie with a car accident, not in Monaco, in another circuit, and he saw that instead of looking at the race, people were looking at the accident. So, when he was racing and passed the tunnel of Monaco Monte Carlo, and there's the curve, and that is always the place where most accidents take place in Monte Carlo, he realized that people were not looking at the fact that he was winning, but they were looking at another thing. So in a second, he realized that something was happening. He remembered the movie, and he started braking the car. And out of the tunnel, he saw all the cars crashed. And this was very close, but he continued, and then he won. So this stuck permanently in his mind. For him, it was a fundamental anecdote. But it has to do with the movie that he saw the night before. It's something that sticks with you for your entire life, even if it was random, and he was happy he was not involved in this accident and he could win the race. On behalf of our museum and the audience that is following us, I would like to thank you for being here, and I also see that you're incredibly similar to Juan Manuel Fangio, who wrote history of Alfa Romeo on these cars. Thank you again. Thank you. Thanks to the audience, to Alfa Romeo, and I hope that this year in the Formula One, with the experience that you gained over the last 2 years, you will be up in the ranking, and I'm sure that this will happen, that you will be higher in the ranking. Formula One is very hard in the modern days. You have to work a lot and need a lot of time to climb the rankings, but I have faith. So, for the audience of Italy and for the people of Alfa Romeo, I wish you a great day. As I said, I lived in Italy when I was racing there in Modena, so I hope to come back and see you again in real life, and thank you, Alfa Romeo. Fangio's career was long and complex, and when he arrived in Europe for the second part, he started from scratch with Grand Prix cars, and he was 36, and then he won at 40 a World Championship. So the three Fs was a very expert team. Nino Farina was 5 years older than Fangio. 1906, Luigi Fagioli was of 1898, the same age of Enzo Ferrari, who withdrew 20 years before. It was an expert team of champions who introduced Alfa Romeo in the Formula One, which was born that year. And as Giuseppe Bussoli said in 1950, the real problem was choosing who of our three Alpha men had to win the race. In 1951, the experience was used to conquer 1 point at a time to bring the second title to Alfa Romeo. But let's have a step backwards. Let's start from the origins, when many years before Fangio started to race. And in order to tell you this story, I'd like to introduce you Professor Alessandro Silva from the Italian Association of the History of Automobiles, but also author of the Back on Track monumental work, which tells everything about the cars, brands, and races of the post-war period. Alessandro Silva, how was the beginning of Fangio's career in Argentina? His first race was in 1934. It was his first race with the Argentinian Automobile Club. So he states that he started racing because it could be an advertisement for a garage that he opened in Balcarce. It was homemade cars. You were racing with these cars that had big American engines and homemade chassis. And then, so these were on circuits, and then in Argentina, the carretera races exploded, boomed. So these were very long races on the street. The first one won by Fangio was Buenos Aires Lima, so very long, and these were usually done with Ford or other engines modified in Argentina for these races. The original Fangio's car was a Chevrolet that he prepared privately, individually, maybe boycotting the brand because he was not a well-known name, and there was this duel, a commercial duel with Ford, and Ford was driven by the famous Galvez. Galvez later became the great rival of Fangio in the Argentinian races. What kind of races were these? Well, there was even a Buenos Aires Caracas in the first years of the post-war era. It was incredible. We cannot even imagine it. It's unthinkable. Of these cars were speeding a lot, the brakes were not excellent, the cars were powerful, and they crossed the Cordillera even above 4,000 meters of altitude, because usually from Argentina, well, they crossed the border going to the opposite coast, the Pacific coast, in Chile or Peru, and then started to go up. So Fangio won several of those races, and he became very well known in 1948. It's a successful career which transforms him into an Argentinian idol, but the risk of interrupting is with the Second World War outbreak. Yes, he was in this situation. He had to stop when his career in this kind of specific races was at the top. And what did he do during the war? During the war, he started to sell used tires. He had a truck. He had this garage in Valcarce, and he toured all around Argentina to buy used tires and resell them. So I don't think it's a legend, it's something that he told many times, that he was driving and driving again, trying to drive with the most swift style of driving for the race, and then he acquired the technique that made him famous in Europe. The roads were not covered in tarmac, so he was a master of what in the 50s, beginning of 60s, was called four-wheel drift. So it's like controlled drift on four wheels, so that the car went sideways and then was straightened, exiting the curve. He was a master of this technique. And you could do this entering the curve with a very high angle. There were pictures of the 1950s, especially the Monza race in 1957, and you see very well the difference with Stirling Moss, the entrance in the parabolic curve. There are wonderful pictures. And at this time, Argentina starts to be interested in European races more than the American ones, and starts to have partnerships with the Italian and European pilots. What happens in Argentina? Argentina is one of the richest countries in the world at the end of the war. And there's a man at the automobile club who decides to incentivize sports race cars in the European style, so as opposed to the carretera races. This man was called Pancho Borgonovo, and he organized several races. Started in the winter of 46-47, and in Argentina the races would begin at the beginning of 47, and he managed to get in contact with the Italians through Corrado Filippini, an Italian journalist. So he managed to hire Villoresi, Varzi, for the races in Argentina, and even before, because there were a couple of races in Brazil around Christmas in 1946, Enrico Blaté, Pintacuda, and Palmieri arrived in Argentina, and the latter was also a salesman of cars, race cars. So the Argentinian pilots started to contact the European ones. But what happens to Fangio? Fangio in that moment has nothing. He has no cars. He's got nothing. And he built a car with a Chevrolet engine, because these races were done for the 3000 Alfa 308, very big cars and similar ones. And then in parallel there was a race for these cars called Mecánica Nacional, which were home-built chassis with engines produced in Argentina, so Chevrolet or Ford, but especially Ford. Fangio, who knew the Chevrolet engine very well, instead builds one with the Chevrolet engine. Its name was La Negrita, because it was black. And despite the fact that the car was homemade and had huge problems of cooling down, so every race they added a radiator, so he fared very well in these parallel races. So what happens for the next season? In 1948, the Argentinian Automobile Club rents some Maseratis, 4CL 1500, and one of the pilots who was chosen to drive them was Fangio. At this point, they decided to create a team for the season of 49. The team, so two Maseratis for CLT 48 are ordered from the Argentinian Automobile Club, and then there's this decision about which pilots had to go to Europe. So the contacts with Varzi, who drove in South America apart from Alfa Romeo in Europe before dying, well, had a lot of contacts, and this allowed logistical and technical support in Gagliate for this team. So they buy these things. Well, Fangio was chosen because, again, we will never know, but it was very fast. Without a doubt, he was fast, and the experts knew that he was a skilled pilot, and he also had a very good relationship with Peron and his wife Evita. So this mix of skills and politics impacted this choice, but it was a good choice in the end. And how did those races go? Well, Fangio arrives. He was known only by those who had already stayed in Argentina, and then in these kinds of races he didn't win a lot in Argentina actually. So he arrived in Europe. The first race is in Sanremo, and he won 6 races in 3 months. It was not a Grand Prix, national Grand Prix, those that would have become the World Championship ones, but these were Formula One races with a good participation of pilots, mostly private ones, but a very high level. Who drove this Maserati for CLT48? At this point, Fangio arrives at Alfa Romeo, but the outlines of this is not clear. In the archive, we have a contract dated April the 1st, 1950, and the contract regulates the arrival of Fangio in Formula One with the 3F team, but it's a preset contract similar to the ones of the other pilots. So there were agreements that have been taken in other places, in other circumstances with other details. Everything has been said and written about Fangio, and everyone agreed on the fact that his character was noble, gentle, polite with everyone. But often it is also said about his preparation, his care and attention, so he tried to eliminate every risk from the races, at least the risks that could be managed at the time. And in some parts, there also an athletic preparation. Today it is normal, but if you think that in the 50s, wine was not banned from races, and often pilots smoke cigar when driving, well, this is peculiar. But in 1950, in the profile of Fangio, in a file called Fangio by Ufficio Propaganda, these words are written: "The calm of the Argentinian man can be revealed by a few specifications. It was 92 kilos and decided to lose weight to be quicker and more agile in the car. He convinced Gonzalez, his friend, who lived in Gagliate with him in the Achille Varzi villa, to follow a diet and exercise. They bought bicycles. Every morning Fangio cycled up to 100 kilometers, and he lost 7 kilos in a few months. So these habits, these virtues of Fangio were confirmed. So he was a modern pilot, or maybe this is part of the construction of a myth. But I believe that his physical preparation was linked to this needed training for the 10,000 kilometers races in 1 week on very primordial cars on terrible roads. And one of the two only severe accidents happened with him happened in 1958. His co-pilot Rutia died. It was also a great childhood friend, and then he was also a great soccer player. I don't know if you remember it, but it was a good soccer player who played in Valcarce team, his town, and he was about to be hired by a like Premier League club, and his fellow citizens wanted him to stay there, so they helped him buy a fuel pump, enlarge his garage. He was a sportsman. I don't know whether this was systematic at the time. For these races, apart from the physical preparation that could be a consequence of these races, not only a prerequisite, I mean the Turismo de Carretera races, but there were aids because you had to be awake for dozens of hours. So he met a brujo, a wizard, who gave him a pill, some pills, and this helped him because he did very well in those races. 1955, when he was with Mercedes and he goes to the Mille Miglia, Sterling Moss, well, he suggests to Sterling Moss to take one of these pills. So Moss takes this pill and he says that, well, they start, Moss then won with an incredible time. He goes out of the car, takes a bath, has dinner, and that same night he takes the Mercedes coupe, goes to Stuttgart without sleeping 1 minute. He goes to Stuttgart to meet the board of Mercedes, goes back on his car, goes to the channel, takes the ferry, goes to England and goes home without sleeping for a minute. And he says that this was the consequence of the pills of the brujo of Fangio. So this is a myth or a legend, but the two severe accidents, 48 and 52 in Monza, were due to physical exhaustion, to fatigue, because in 52, I'm talking about Fangio, in 52, the day before, he was racing in England, then he goes to Paris, there's fog, he cannot take a plane, Louis Rosier gives him a car, he drives the car and he arrives in Monza on Sunday morning, and after 2 laps he goes off-road. He was lucky. He was a lucky man. Very lucky man. Professor Silva, thank you. As a fan, more than as a host, for your precious contribution. As always, the Backstage devotes a part to archival documents and objects that usually are not exposed, exhibited in the museum. Started with the archive documents, we would like to underline one of the most important results, the World Championship 1951 win of the Argentinian champion in Spain, the Spain Grand Prix 1951. So he won there, and there are the details of everything, the correspondence, the letters, the tariffs, the hotels, the transfers, and in an epoch when a GPS still had a long way to come, a way was found to indicate the place where the hotels and the tracks were located with the military picture You see, again with a pointer and the target of the bombardiers. So it was a military picture. And then we have press reviews. Today we think that the press review is just file with the titles, the headlines of the newspapers, but at the time the press review was done for each event, for each race, and assembled very meticulously. And an entire volume was devoted to the Spain Grand Prix, and this exists for all the Formula One or championships and races. So there are several sessions. The press review before the Grand Prix, where the headlines are, for example, Barcelona, the final fight, introducing the rivalry between the Alfa Romeo of Fangio and the two Ferraris. And then, if we continue, there are cartoons, the parodies, because at the time the newspapers lived this rivalry of the champions Fangio, Gonzalez, Ascari, who will be the world champion in 1951, and then there's the coverage of national and international press, and then you have the after the end of the race. So apart from the congratulations, also polemics start. What will be about the Alfa Romeo? It says here in the Portello, nothing more is the buzz. So we knew that there were new cars, and even the driving seat was behind the rear wheels. But Alfa Romeo had incredible results after those 2 years of races. Everyone was happy about the brand. The market recovered. It was almost impossible that after all those victories, Alfa had to withdraw. Of course, to devote to mass production, to Giulietta, but it was a withdrawal. And then we continue with a series of interviews, also with some curious notes collected after the Grand Prix of Spain. Fangio, as always, is calm. He has a vision of a race, and he underlines that he's always been available to respect the orders of the team, as he did many times in 1950, and that he says he did in 1951. He would have even given up to the World Championship, he says, but his real human character emerges from the last question. So the night before Barcelona, Fangio slept in peace after reading BPT, Argentinian newspaper. Then he raced and he won the championship. And the next night you cannot say it's mine, as mine are the joys and the sufferings. I just think that it's difficult to be able to lose, but also to win. Even more, the first to congratulate with me was Ascari. I did the same in Monza. Races are races, and I cannot calculate everything. So this happened in Barcelona for the quickest lap. It was a distraction, now pleasant, but if in that moment I knew I was in the quickest lap, I would have not pushed so much in order not to risk. I didn't want to lose a title for lightheartedness. I did it for Alfa and for me, and I'm happy. And for Alfa Romeo, that was an incredible success, but also a reason of pride from the entire team. So we will talk about Fangio for years. Press releases will continue to arrive. Events would be organized also on the house organs of the company as the Circle of Workers. The title is Alfa Romeo 6,000 Workers World Champion in 1951, and an entire number is dedicating to the story of the races which went down history for the witnesses. We talked about the press release, but apart from the normal one, there are also press reviews, reports, and everything of each race. Now everything is done. The TV news are so quick and they spread from the paddocks to the public, but in the past, first word spread in the circuit and then long sheets of paper like this were used to write everything, the laps, the notes one by one, and then you define the final report of the race that was then sent all over the world, not through email or TV, but via press releases like this one, the Associated Press, through teleprinter, and at the time it meant generating for the most important races to very, very long prints that were then distributed all over the world. And then there are personal memories. One of the most renowned is the sketches that Giampaolo Garcea did during his career, and that gave way in the 90s to a book called La Mia Alfa, My Alpha. Here we have the sketches of cars, mechanics crossing the Alps, paddocks, and the small towns that for the first time are crossed after World War II to bring the cars to the racetracks, but there's also a picture of an older Fangio, here with Camillo Marchetti, the great external relations, to whom we will devote a backstage, not this year, but soon. And that he will continue to welcome Fangio at the museum, where he's always happy to touch the car that gave him so many satisfaction. Apart from the Alfetta, though, the career of Fangio continues for several years in Alfa Romeo. We have a contract of 1953 where he engages to race 6-7 races for sports cars. He will not race all of them, but two will be very important. One is 1953 Mille Miglia, whose victory was lost for a second. The C3000 CM, so 3000 CM means competizione maggiorata, enhanced competition, was an extremely sophisticated car, and it goes at the top not only with Fangio's team but before also with Sanesi's one, which then had to withdraw, and then Kling goes on top, then Kling had to withdraw, and Fangio goes at the top of the race. But then he faces the same problem that obliged his teammates to withdraw. So the driving style of Fangio is very sweet and clean, so that the car lasted more. But an error in the chassis construction made very brittle the front part. So the wheel starts to wobble and the steering arm broke, and Fangio will be overpassed by Ferrari just a few meters before the finish line, arriving at second place, but that would have deserved a victory. The 6.3 3000 cm is then evolved, and the Spider Merano is built, the one which is here kept at the museum today. And with this car that in 1955 would have aeronautical derivation brakes, Fangio won the Supercorte Maggiore championship around Merano, and this is again one of the jewels of the museum with its incredible sound, and it was the car that Fangio drove. And there's also a small trace of Fangio the pilot on the oil dipstick, which is unusual as we are used to see it today. There's again handwritten by a mechanic, Fangio. So a champion who won 5 world championships would deserve more than a short narration. But what we can, with a smile, remember again is how many times his career, his life, his character intertwined with Alfa Romeo, with people, men, colleagues, mechanics, that again in the 70s and 80s were happy to receive his visits, always shy, always polite, as he was driving with the tip of his hands. So he was driving at 300 kilometers per hour. He had a controlled drift, but he just had very few serious accidents. This probably was one of the reasons of his great sports success. Juan Manuel Fangio, a great winner that we would like to thank and we cherish for two reasons. One, because he gave Alfa Romeo the second world title, and then because he was born in a special date, 1911, but June the 24th, just like Alfa Romeo. Now, just a short break, and we will be back for the Q&A. Thank you.
And here we are back to the Q&A. Now you are the main protagonists. You have the microphone virtually. You're not here with us, but we try to answer your questions anyway by reading the questions that you send us in the chat box or on our social networks or by phone. So, first of all, I'd like to introduce again Raffaella Quaccaro, the External Relations Managers of the Museum, and our guest, Lorenzo Boscarelli, President of AISA, Italian Association for the History of Automobile, that apart from being so kind to be here live today, also allowed us to speak with Professor Alessandro Silva, that I thank again for his speech. And I'd like to start exactly from Lorenzo Boscarelli. Lorenzo, you were telling me that you didn't meet directly Fangio, but you have an anecdote which is very close to him. Yes, at the end of the 70s, I went to the garage of Juan Manuel Fangio and with Giulio Saletta, who ran in 1953 the Mille Miglia with Juan Manuel Fangio. So that is an important episode for Alfa Romeo because the competition was from Brescia to Firenze, dominated by Alfa Romeo, and then Fangio arrived second place. Why? Because between Rome and Florence, in Rome, Kling was at the head, after that Samesi was heading the race until Popoli, that is in Abruzzo region. But between Rome and Florence, on Fangio's cars, some steering problems appeared, and Saletta said that originally they thought it was a defect similar to the one which had already occurred on Alfa Romeo Sprint. So in Florence they checked the steering wheel, but they could not identify the problem. So in Florence, Fangio was heading the race, but between Firenze and Bologna, Marzotto takes the lead because the steering problems increased. So once they pass Bologna, along the Via Emilia in Pontenure, a dozen of kilometers before Piacenza, there was a bump and the steering mechanism was damaged very severely, but they continued the race. And I managed to get to Brescia. And Saletta said that the very difficult moment was the bridge of Cremona, because it's a narrow bridge. It's a steel bridge that maybe some of you know. And in the curves, people and spectators, fans were jumping around, and the car was not stable, but in the end they arrived in Brescia at second place. So it was really a race which caused problems. So at the end of this anecdote, I asked to Saletta, but how was Fangio as a pilot, as a driver? And he said he was a good driver. He was safe with the gears. So Saletta was a man of a few words, but he went straight to the point. Well, the 3000 cm was and still is a fantastic car, but with a chronic problem at the friction and the transmission. So Saletta, who was a very peculiar character of Alfa Romeo, he was for a long time a specialist of fuels. He started at 8 cylinders of Alfetta with just a quarter of a turn. But he was also the person who, in order to be hired for Romeo, waited for Ugo Gobato standing at the end of the Second World War for days outside the Portello before obtaining a meeting with him. But he remembered the precision of Fangio. Raffaella, are there questions? Yes, about the 3000 cm. Is it working? They also asked about the Alfetta 659, but we already saw it, that it went to Silverstone. But the 6C 3000 cm, yes, the 6C 3000 cm is in excellent conditions. It's a car that has already been inside the Alfa Romeo premises. There was 5 cars built, and this was the last one remained at the designing department, and it was used for many tests, but also as a backup for the first brakes that were installed in 1955 and are still there. So it was not a coupe version, which was prepared for the Mille Miglia in 1953, but it was called Spider Merano, who won the Gran Premio Cortemaggiore with Fangio. It is a car which has unmistakable characteristics, and the curious note that you can appreciate every time you do maintenance here at the museum and you switch it on is the sound. It has 6 cylinders in line with 6 carburetors, 1 per each cylinder. It is a joy that we hope we can share with you live. Michele is asking us a few more information about the fact that in 1977, Fangio, together with Carlos Reutemann, financed the Argentinian team who won TCC class with Alfa Sud Sprint, prepared by Autodelta. Do we have any more information? I don't remember this episode, but I'm not surprised because Fangio, for his entire life, remained linked and connected to the world of races. For example, he was one of the first to recognize the value of Jackie Stewart. When Jackie Stewart won in 1964 the Grand Prix of Monte Carlo, the Formula 3, at the end of the race, Juan Manuel Fangio, who didn't know him, went to greet him. He was very kind and nice with Jackie Stewart. And Jackie Stewart maintained always a nice memory of Fangio from the human point of view, apart from as a sportsman. Well, this is not a question, actually. It's a comment arriving from Pablo. We thank him because he's always very active and he participates in all our backstages, but he's an Argentinian, so he was very interested in this one. And he says that a 6C 3000 cm was given to the Mr. Perron, the general. Yes, the 6C 3000 cms, for their structure, were extreme cars that could be compared to the Barchette Sport of Ferrari Maserati of the same years. But it also had an architecture of engine and a suspension scheme which was very modern, apart from a very modern braking system, making them more tame than the competitors. And this allowed Alfa to structure them as road cars, apart from the one that we have here at our back. There was one which was sent to Perron, but there was another one very famous because in 1953 one of the chassis was taken by Pininfarina, who decided to use it as a starting point for a prototype called Superflow. It was a very low prototype with a soap bar line, and without modifications apart from proportions, which are fundamentally different. 12 years ago were imitated to create the Duetto, which was designed by Aldo Pravarone for Pininfarina. So that prototype represents the mother of the Duetto, one of the most iconic cars of Alfa Romeo, and is based on a chassis of a 6C3000 CM. Another question for Lorenzo. On the 159, and particularly on the lap in Silverstone that Kimi Räikkönen performed 2 years ago. How did he drive this car, which is so distant from the ones that he drives usually? Well, we should say several things. First of all, that was a fantastic moment because the English fan has a certain sensitivity for historical cars like the Alfetta. During those laps by Räikkönen, the people jumped on the stands, and also the experts who were working at the racetrack were enthusiastic. The other thing that I'd like to say is that Räikkönen was smiling. He was super happy to drive this car for two reasons. One, because he had fun, and this was a given. And secondly, because he had the opportunity to finish the lap with way before the other pilots who had to stop every 2-3 curves to sign autographs, and this was a good reason for him to be happy. But let's get back to the car. The Alfetta is an extremely complex car to be driven. It has a 2-stadium compressor. It has a fuel jet which is cold injected. It is methanol, which is like an open faucet, 400 meters with 1 liter. And you have to drive this car with extreme sensitivity. Usually today's pilots have a on-off attitude. They change shift very rapidly, but Räikkönen, as a true professional pilot, before driving asks the basic instructions. So how to press on the pedals, how to use the shift, how to use the steering wheel, which instruments he had to keep an eye on. And though he seated on this car for the first time and he was smiling before starting, he followed all the indications, and the lap he performed was extraordinary for him, for the museum, and for all the supporters who were there watching it. So Räikkönen has the license to drive all the cars of the museum. So I've got a couple of questions for Mr. Boscarelli. And our link to Gianpaolo is asking us, like Nuvolari, there's no one, because he drove with a tool instead of the steering wheel. And Mattea asks how Fangio is placed compared to the other drivers. Well, concerning Nuvolari, there are several legends. What happened is that in a race in 1946 at the Valentino in Turin, when Nuvolari had a Cisa Italia 46 1,100 cubic centimeters with an engine by Fiat 1,100, at one point the wheel came off because in that kind of car it was detachable, but he went to the paddock and he stopped, so it didn't drive without the steering wheel and with a spanner as its legend. So it is a funny legend. Concerning Fangio, it is usually told that each pilot should be judged according to what he does in his era, because the conditions of the races, of cars, etc. are so different from an era to another that it is very difficult to make comparisons between pilots of different eras. But what happened over the last few years, a researcher at the University of Sheffield in England realized a mathematical model which was published on the famous British magazine The Economist, which is maybe the most important magazine in the world. So it was a serious research. So that puts in comparison all the pilots who raced from 1950 to today, keeping into account several parameters, applying a mathematical model that keeps into account of the performances of the pilot, but also the co-pilots, the team members, timings, wins, etc. Well, to make it a long story short, it emerged that Fangio was the best pilot from 1950 to 2020. Out of curiosity, I'm telling you that at second place we have Jimmy Clark, which I hope you remember. Third place, Alain Prost, and fourth place, Jackie Stewart. It is a ranking which, just like any ranking, is not final, but it can make us think a lot that we have Juan Manuel Fangio at first place. And we also answer with to Rodolfo's question. So 5 World Championship, Fangio is the best of all times, since the pilot made the difference at the time. Yes, and also the capacity of the pilot to get the best car, because Fangio won 5 World Championships with 5 different cars. So Fangio had the merit of surviving and living enough to drive all those championships, apart from winning them. The capacity of driving better than the others, not only in a faster way, but also in a more consistent way, and also the capacity, the vision to understand which was the team that was about to become strong before it became strong. Not in the case of Alfa Romeo. When Fangio started, Alfa Romeo was already the one to beat. Cosimo asks whether the Alfetta 160 remained a project on paper or it was realized, and if there is a model. Well, the Gran Premio 160 had to answer to 1952 changes in the regulations. So from the 1500 enhanced, we went to 750. So the atmospheric engine, 2.5 liters of cylinders, were back on the track. So the 160 was built around a 12 centimeters boxer engine with a single carburetor, so 12 carburetors all synchronized, and this could create nightmares to many, but not to Saletta, who was the master of the carburetor. But it has a single tube at the center, of which there was an engine on the back bridge, just like on the Alfetta. There was a transmission, so they shift the gears, and then there was a mast that, starting from the transmission, passed through to the engine mast and then connected a differential, which was for the front wheels, and the tank instead was behind the engine, so again at the center of the tube, in order to avoid one of the typical problems of those cars with the front engine, the fact that the setup changed and the balance changed if the tank was full or not. So having said so, it's like a modern concept, but something is lacking. Where is the pilot? The pilot in this car could not find a position unless it could be behind the back wheels. So everyone said, is it possible or not? Can the pilot drive or not? And the verdict was given on the track. So a 159 was taken, it was modified very roughly, not even the windscreen was displaced. So the driving seat was put at the back. Sanesi went on the track in Monza and it was 2.5 seconds slower than the best done with 159, but in that lap he lost his glasses because the windshield was not in a good position, so with one hand he had to take the glasses, with the other one he had to drive, and he said, yes, I can do that, I can drive because I can see how the car performs before. So once the position was not a problem, the designing of the car started to be more intense. At the same time, the Alfa Romeo calculates the cost to readapt to a 159, to redesign everything. But in the end, before the season of 1952, Alfa decides, for industrial reasons and for reasons of image, to withdraw from those races. So the 160 is never finished. What is finished is some series of components for the engine, and one of the complete engines with the magnesium differentials and the block with the engine is exposed here at the museum next to 159 Alfetta, because it represents its evolution, even though it's an evolution that remained only a vision, because Alfa withdrew from those races, leaving way to the Ferrari, which is 1952-1953, with the F2 wins 2 World Championships in a row, the only 2 World Championships that Fangio didn't win in that era. Fangio, as we heard from the Witness of the Sun, always was very connected to Alfa Romeo. He had a very special relationship. So, someone says that the relationship with another big Italian brand, Ferrari, is different. There was any reason, every specific anecdote? Well, let's say that Fangio was a person with a strong character. So, in order to risk on the Formula One, you have to be strong-willed, of course, but Fangio was a well-structured person. He was not a young boy. He was not 20 when he landed at Ferrari. He was 45 because he was 56, 1956. So, legend has it, but there are many witnesses about this, that Ferrari was a person who tended to put one pilot against the other, and Fangio didn't like this attitude. There is an important anecdote concerning the win in the World Championship of 1956, because at the time pilots could change their car during the race, and in the end the points conquered were divided between the two pilots who drove the car during the race. So there's a famous episode of the Italian Grand Prix when Collins was asked to give the car to Fangio because Fangio's car was broken. Collins generously did it. In the end, Moss won, but Fangio had a good placement and he gains important points for the World Championship. So with this episode, we can conclude that Ferrari tended to say that his pilots won for the merit of the cars, the Ferraris, not for their merit, and probably Fangio was not happy about this when he won the World Championship. So Professor Silva said that La mia vita 300 all'ora is a fairy book, so one of the almost autobiography books of Fangio, which also gave way to a movie in the 1970s, shows that Fangio has always a wary attitude, unless when he talks about Enzo Ferrari. So he has strong words, but probably some tricks were not particularly appreciated by that pilot. So I'd like to give a big hug to the many friends that we find in the comments and that are following us from any part of the world: Holland, Germany, Spain, Mexico, Argentina. Many of these are always with us during the backstages, so we are happy that we can share this episode with them also from remote, even though we cannot welcome them here at our museum. Some of them are asking us when will it be possible to come back, how, and if we will continue these live streams on Facebook to give the opportunity to those who cannot move to follow anyway the activity of the museum and the history of this brand. Well, it's not a mystery. We would all want to be here with you in real life. As of today, there are no conditions to open museums or held conferences, but what we can say is that the calendar, the agenda of 2021 for the Backstage is confirmed. So we will continue to live stream until it will not be possible to meet you here. I know it's not the same thing. It's not the same thing for us as well, but at least we try to maintain the museum alive and to keep you entertained, because I wait for you, not to hug you because it will not be possible, but to welcome you here to the museum. So yes, first of all, we have March the 28th, another Backstage dedicated to Vittorio Iano, again linked to this one date celebrating the anniversary this year, and then for the entire season. Of course, you can be updated following our website, our social channels, and we hope that our audience, virtual and physical, will always be entertained, will always be with us in good numbers and enthusiastic. Do you have any other questions, Raffaella? No? We can stop. And let's see. Another Backstage on March 28th. Yes, I would like to thank Mr. Lorenzo Boscarelli, Professor Silva, who gave us a great contribution, Oscar Fangio, who of course was the cherry on the cake, and all of our colleagues, Raffaella, Antonio, Gemma, who contributed to this live stream. And thank you to you that on Sunday afternoon, despite the nice sunny and almost spring weather, wanted to follow us anyway, living the history of Alfa Romeo. Thank you. See you next time.